House of the Dragon, Season 1, Episode 4, King of the Narrow Sea, just released. Personally, I loved it. I thought it was very thematically concise and interesting. I thought it had a lot about relationships and the change they undergo, particularly the negative change they undergo in several cases, seeing both positive growth followed by active decay. Particularly, there was one thing in this episode that I thought was really cool and could tie into the future of this series as a whole in a really interesting way. This is going to deal with some history from the books, however, this is not a video that will contain any spoilers for the majority of House of the Dragon, so if you have not read the books, feel free to keep watching, you should be fine here. And if you enjoy this and want to hear more of my analysis, I'd really appreciate it if you left a like and subscribed. I'm slowly climbing up in terms of subscriber count, and I'd really appreciate anybody joining me if they want to hear more of this. So yeah, let's jump into the analysis of one particular scene at the start of this episode. So the episode begins in the interior of Storm's End that we've actually never seen before. We saw the exterior of it and the dungeons beneath it in Game of Thrones, but we've never actually been inside. We see Rhaenyra, along with Lord Boris Baratheon and Sir Criston Cole, receiving a large number of suitors there. She hears from a couple of them. First one, Lord Dondarrion, who we know, Beric Dondarrion from the first series, followed by a young boy of House Blackwood, who quickly begins arguing with someone from House Bracken. These two houses are quite interesting, especially if you read the books, and I'm going to explain exactly why. The Blackwoods and the Brackens both have a lot in common, more than just both starting with B. Both of them are ancient houses from the Riverlands, both of whom claim descent from the First Men. As that name implies, these First Men were the initial inhabitants of Westeros prior to the Andals making their arrival, and forming many of the other great houses of the land, and instating their gods, which is the Seven, as compared to the Old Gods, which are worshipped by both the Blackwoods and the Brackens. Both of these houses were kings at a point in their history. However, the Blackwoods have an old and bitter feud against the Brackens, and vice versa. According to the Blackwoods, the Brackens were petty lords and horse breeders who hired swords to usurp the Blackwood kings. They believe that this is the case, and because of this, they hold a grudge to this day. And we saw that grudge on display in this episode of House of the Dragon. In this episode of House of the Dragon, we saw Benjicott Blackwood, also known as Bloody Ben. You'll see why he gets that nickname in some time, but I won't spoil that. He's a boy at this point, no more than 10 or 11, but he was vying for the hand of Rhaenyra Targaryen, who, in terms of age, he is a better match for than, say, Aegon or, say, Jason Lannister. Benjicott is kind of stating his claim and seems to be a very nice kid, though he is egged on by someone from House Bracken. I don't know if we know their exact name. Because of this, Bloody Ben attacks him, and it seems to be that he killed the Bracken man, though we don't see the conclusion of that conflict itself. I thought this was a really interesting point to draw attention to, particularly because of how they've talked about House of the Dragon in the past. When discussing this show in interviews, some of the showrunners of House of the Dragon have said that this might not be contained to this specific area in history. They could examine earlier points, like Aegon's conquest of Westeros, or later points. The most important of these, to me, and most interesting to examine, is the Blackfyre Rebellions. These are a series of 5 rebellions later in the history of A Song of Ice and Fire, completely unrelated to the events of the House of the Dragon show as it currently stands, so you don't have to worry about spoilers for that here. But in that conflict, 2 of its most important drivers are related to both House Bracken and House Blackwood. House Bracken has Aegor Rivers, who is the bastard son of King Aegon IV, also known as the Unworthy. These events take place far after House of the Dragons. This is a different Aegon than we've just met there. But he also had another bastard son, or one of many, that one being Brynden Rivers, who was known as Bloodraven. Aegor Rivers was known as Bittersteel. These 2 men had a long and bitter conflict that embroiled the realm for decades and led to countless lives being lost. And I think that the fact that they've just essentially set this conflict up in House of the Dragon is a potentially ingenious move of storytelling. It's a form of essentially Chekhov's gun-ing this entire conflict, in that you're placing the idea of this long-lasting conflict between the Brackens and the Blackwoods before the viewer. So they have this to essentially use as context for if they were to jump forward to the Blackfyre Rebellion after the events of this current iteration of House of the Dragon was concluded. And furthermore, it's interesting to see these houses in conflict because they tend to just be opposed to each other in terms of any conflict in the history of Westeros. And we may see that going forward in House of the Dragon as well. This was really exciting to me as a book fan because I thought that it could be a great way to set up the Blackfyre Rebellion, which is one of my favorite eras in A Song of Ice and Fire history, and it has a lot to do with the current A Song of Ice and Fire / Game of Thrones timeline. So it could be really interesting to see explored, and it could lead to further revelations about the kind of canon or non-canon even reality of the situation, as currently all we have are history accounts in-universe. It is also worth noting that these two houses are fairly magically important. The blood of the first men is often considered an important factor in why the Starks are able to skin change wolves, as they often do in the main series books of A Song of Ice and Fire. And it is hinted that they may have gotten these abilities through gaining first men blood from marriages with some of these houses, specifically the Blackwoods, though I'm not going to get into specifics of that, as that could spoil elements of seasons of House of the Dragons, though very minor ones. But I still don't want to risk that. But yeah, I think it's quite interesting that they have that potential focus on that, and having these two houses in the picture this early could be a good sign for the future of their importance. It's little touches like this that give me a lot more confidence in House of the Dragon as a whole. It seems like a show that is really made with love, both for the viewers and for the source material, and I really appreciate that. And really setting up this potential seed for the future shows me that they might have hope to someday do future events, such as the Blackfyre Rebellions, which I would absolutely love to see. But yeah, that was my main thought on the Bracken and Blackwood conflict, and that being foreshadowed in this episode. I really enjoyed that, and I really enjoyed the episode as a whole. Be sure to leave a comment, let me know what you think of both these houses in conflict. Do you have one that you prefer, or what you thought about the episode as a whole? I might make another video on it in the future as well. I think that Kristen Cole got some really interesting characterization here that he did not have in the book and could inform future actions in some really interesting ways. So yeah, if you enjoy this, be sure to leave a like, subscribe, like I said earlier. I'd really appreciate that. And yeah, thank you all for watching. Have a nice day.